Welcome to Uppsala University and to UppTalk Weekly. My name is Lina Emilsson. I'm your host here today at this popular science seminar organized by the Faculty of Science and Technology. UppTalk Weekly is created to give alumni and everyone interested a possibility to learn more about the science being conducted at our university, to meet our researchers and to ask your questions, which you can do today throughout this seminar in the chat. Today, our guest is Prax, a researcher in co-creation of game design, who focuses on how societal values shape design of video games and their impact on the society. Specifically, he studies players' games literacy and the opportunities and challenges that comes with digital games, such as increased learning and sustainable policies, and on the other hand, addiction and radicalization. Welcome to UppTalk Weekly, Patrick.
Thank you so much, Lina. Thank you for your introduction. That was really good.
Super happy to have you here.
Yeah, likewise. This is really exciting.
Let's start up by giving our audience a possibility to learn more about you and your professional journey. So I will leave the word for you to introduce yourself in your own words.
Yes. Yes, my name is Patrick. I am now working here as an associate professor in the game design department. I'm originally German, and I started my, journey coming here to this university, first meeting my wife as an exchange student in Athens, as an Erasmus student, then following to Uppsala and then studying there to study media studies. And I have been a gamer for a long time, but that allowed me to then see that wow, these critical research perspectives that come from media and communication studies, how would they apply to something like games, something that didn't happen so much, that was really, at that point, still something like, what, you can study video games and research, that's the thing. So following up that perspective and also looking through some of the things that personally impact me, like starting out with a bachelor thesis about leadership in games, because that was something that I was doing when I was in Sweden, didn't know so many people, and still connected back home to groups that I was already a part of for a long time, that allowed me to experience myself as socially competent, while maybe I couldn't speak the local language so well yet, and it was quite tricky to be here. So there was this sort of social lifeline, and that intrigued me to study games further.
So, before we go into the research that you do, I would like to talk to you about game design. I mean, lots of people heard about games, but not maybe everybody thought about the design of games. So would you like to tell us a little about what is game design in your?
Of course, I'd love to. So games are oftentimes, and you're right, people aren't necessarily thinking about them as much as something that you can make. And that is sometimes curious, because one of the things that are so fascinating to me with games is that the step from playing them to making them is so very short, right? This moment where you are done playing a board game to, this was great, but do you know how it would be even better? And then you have like a different version of a rule. You're watching kids playing and making and designing, going hand in hand, always already connected. And I think that's one of the core things that is so intriguing and so amazing with games. But the other part, of course, being that games as a media express themselves through rules. So that is the difference here. There's basically two main differences between games and other kinds of media. They're not super hard, but games stress, I would call that procedural expression, right? So you have rules that show how something works, and they can represent the world in a way and make that understandable for the players as a way of engaging with them. Something that maybe books or text or TV doesn't quite do in the same way. So you could play a game about how hard it can be as somebody at the poverty line to make ends meet. And sure, you could read about that, but if you play the game and suddenly, oh, wow, your car broke down. Shit, now I'm behind on rent. And it's a different way of seeing and understanding the system, right? So that is one of the things. And the other part is, of course, interactivity, that you're not watching something unfolding, but that you are part of this. You take decisions, you have at least more explicit agency in the process, which can also lead to that it stresses immersion. That means that is an interesting word that we use a lot in game design. To be immersed in something is basically to be dipped into it, right? You could be immersed in water when you're diving. And in the same way, you are immersed in a game when you are so deeply in it with your head that it feels like you're not sitting in front of a board game or looking at a computer screen. You are with your mind in it. You are immersed in it. And that sort of emotion is something that we oftentimes design for. And that is something that games do very, very well. Books as well. You can totally be swallowed up by a story, but games stress that moment a little bit more.
So there's a lot of different designs, and we this is a department of game design, so we educate people in game design. So what is the difference of designing a game than, for example, designing an engine or designing a communication tool, or you know?
Yes, right. I think if you compare it to something like an engine, then I think for games, and this is also what we stress in our education, we design for emotional outcomes of play, right? The thing that you want to design as a game designer is the experience of the player. We could, for example, call that aesthetics, where there's one way of sort of framing it, or some sort of transformative experience on the side of the player. So this is what we want to do, but we cannot access that directly. That doesn't really work that way, because then we cannot use interactivity. We cannot have players experience this as something they do themselves. So instead, it's some sort of second level design. You create a game that sets the stage, builds the structure for the players to act in it, and then make and co-create this experience. So that is really the amazing and interesting part here, that you do this and setting this up for then players to do something with, to make it their own. And oftentimes they will surprise you and do with it something completely different than what you imagined. And then maybe even take the next step and say, you know what, that was a great design. I'm going to change it. I'm going to make it even better or different, or tell a different story, right? So that is very, very interesting. And then we can also immediately come to also the political questions that are connected to these kind of things, right? One example that probably everybody knows is Monopoly. One of the games that really sort of everyone has played it. As the game exists right now, it's very curious because it consistently gets voted to be the worst board game in existence. And it's a board game that aesthetics-wise oftentimes has the situation where somebody is losing, but then they have to keep losing for a long time while the other one who's already in the winning seat gets to take more and more away from them. It's a game about monopoly, about owning everything and accumulating all the capital. That started out as an activist game. It started out as the landlord's game, where you would play the game to show that the system in which landlords owned housing and the people who are renting it, they would never be able to get out of that treadmill to reach a home ownership themselves. So it got modified a little bit, and then strangely that sort of very exploitative and capitalist version was the one that spread itself so widely, while we don't have others anymore. So then we could explore how we can get different narratives out as well and see the world differently. And I think for that, games are predestined to show us how the world could be in a different way.
We're going to come back to this, Patrick.
Yes.
But before we get on to that, I would like still to keep on hold us back a little bit around game design.
Sorry for running away there.
No, that's okay. This is what this room is for. But I would like to say, what are the key design elements for anyone sitting out there listening to this talk? What should, when you're designing a game, what are the key design elements that we have with us?
So one of the things, of course, is the game rules, right? And that is true. Typically, when we start designing a game, we build a prototype and we have some sort of core loop for the game. That is sort of the core rules and direction, the things that you do in the game. There's a lot of ways to think about them. Some of them more incorporate what are the actions that the player can take and what are the barriers they have to overcome, what are their aims, right? So different theoretical starting points, but most of them in some way connect to what are the rules of the game? How do they function? How do we play the game, right? What is the gameplay like? But of course, the aesthetics in the sense of the art, the narrative, the story, the representation also plays a very, very big role and is something that video game art, but also board game art representation is something that is really, really core to this as well. We see this many, many times. We have, for example, players who play card games with their beautifully illustrated magic cards, and collecting them and looking at these beautiful artifacts is as much a part of the gameplay as the other elements, right? I play, for example, Warhammer, where you paint little miniatures. Here is one, right? It's like a little painted dude. So making this little artifact, making this little grass patch on here, that is as much a part of the enjoyment of that hobby and that play as manipulating the rules and winning the game or devising the dominant strategy. So we have rules that are a relevant part. Of course, the narrative, the looks, the feel of things, having like a satisfying feel on the pieces of the board that you build or manipulate, right? What is the weight of this cube piece that you're throwing, and how does that feel, and how does it bounce is part of it, right? So all of these kind of elements are relevant. And then when you make a game, oftentimes this is not made, and I have this perfect idea, now I'm just going to build it, but it's made through iteration. So we have an idea where we would like to go, we build this version together, and then we test it. And maybe we don't quite get to this experience goal that we wanted to have. So then we collect data about it. And the next time, iterate it, change it a little bit to see how can we get closer. And that is a very, very central and core part of game design, to not expect that your first time will hit the bullseye, but to iterate and get closer to your aim.
I think that co-creation is a good thing to talk about here also.
Yes.
So you do a lot of game design through co-creation. And what does that mean?
So co-creation is an interesting frame here, right? Because we've already heard, or I mentioned that, assigning the role of the player some sort of co-creator status. So, right, as mentioned before, as the designer, you make a game as an infrastructure, as a place for people to then play with it and make their own experience. So there's a moment of empowering the player as an active participant in making that game session, in making that experience. So that is already a part of that is very, very central to games and more stressed. Of course, again, something similar happens in other stories. Any communication is in some way also active on the side of the audience. Understanding and decoding language or visual signs or just reading is an active process in meaning making. But in games, that goes a little bit further, because you can change what the outcome of the story is. It's not set in stone yet. The outcome, the story will be different depending on what you do. And then co-creation can take a step even further, where players can, right? And that's the simplest version of that is making house rules for games and then sharing them. And then oftentimes the house rule versions of the games become how these games are played anyways everywhere, making different setups and then modifying these games a little bit. And when we look a little bit closer at, for example, mods, which is another term for modification in digital environments, player co-creation there reaches a level where, in similar ways to analog games, also digital games really live and become alive and have these rapid iteration cycles of innovation, making new things, discovering new and better ways of playing the games, when players take over really also even more of the maker's seat and showing their version of what this game could be doing, making that possible to upload, to change that, right? We have historic examples where really the most magnificent, new, interesting, innovative designs, for the most part, come from players and player creators who make new things. Today, we have huge esports games that are dominating and filling stadiums, have more viewers than analog sports. Nearly every single esports game title has its origin in player creativity. All of these games have been made by players first and have then been adapted and polished and sort of built into these big stadium global phenomena, then by companies. But before, the creative elements, these lie with players.
Like a bottom-up drive into the...
Exactly. So that is happening from the grassroots, from the bottom up.
You mentioned here these big arenas of play. I mean, video games are everywhere today. It's just, exploding media to be for entertainment, but also for other things that we will talk about in a bit. But I know that you are out in schools, among other places, to talk about game literacy.
Yes.
So what is game literacy, and why do you go out and meet young people and talk about game literacy? So
the game literacy is, literacy as a concept normally comes again from reading, right? So it's appropriated from another media. And here literacy simply means being able to read. For games, then that means that being able to understand how games make meaning. And that comes in a number of different varieties. And yes, I have just published an article about that is trying to define critical game literacy and what that could mean. So game literacy as a starting point means being able to read this sort of expression through rules of how games function as a player. And then maybe also active literacy, making, remaking, modifying games as an extension for critical literacy. And that leads into the issues that we will talk about in a second. That could also mean being aware of and being vigilant for problematic aspects of game design, or how games are being made and being sold and monetized, so that players don't fall easy prey to exploitative schemes, to dark design patterns, to ways in which games want to have players spend a little bit more time or money or energy or just the part of their identity into them than maybe they would intend and what's good for them. So
what is your goal when you're out meeting children? Why did you start doing it? And why do you think it's important to talk about how games are built?
And there we get a part into a little bit of maybe if I get to pick that up, the topic of the talk, right? The beauty and the beast.
Go ahead.
We have been talking about the beautiful parts of the games, and they are clearly absolutely relevant, right? I mean, I have dedicated my life to studying them because of the beautiful elements that come with games and the really helpful social participatory effects that they also had for me. But at the same time, games also have that dark side, where they can be used to exploit players, to act as some sort of malicious propaganda that can radicalize, especially young players, or pull them into online spaces where they are radicalized, typically to the alt-right or some sort of political perspectives like that. They couldn't be leading to, movements like QAnon or other conspiracy theories.
So what is that, QAnon?
QAnon is a conspiracy theory originating from the United States that is now basically a catch-all that incorporates a lot of other theories like flat Earth or 4G or the stripes after the planes. That there's some sort of evil dark elite behind manipulating us people, and it is a means for politically radicalizing people online. And sadly, games and the games community has been one of the places where some of the strategies and tactics that are employed in these sort of spaces have been tried out and utilized first and tested out, even to the place where, for example, a political conservative and basically a misogynist movement in the games community that's called Gamergate has pushed members from this movement into being in a position where one of the people that were part of this was the press secretary for Donald Trump when he entered the White House. So it has really mainstreamed a particular kind of propaganda and the conspiracy theory that pushed people to the political right. So we have many big issues in the games community, misogyny just being one of them, and political radicalization, exploitation of players where they spend more money than maybe they would like to. Game addiction is becoming a bigger and bigger word and element in public debate. People sitting at home and not going out. So many of these effects that we also need to clearly lift up and not just push to the side, but we need to address them as well. So that means that something like game literacy could be helpful for young people to give them a little bit of a leg up to not get impacted by the dark side, right? The beast side of the coin of games as much, to support them a little bit so that they can get the positive, empowering elements of games and gaming for their future and hopefully sidestepping the more malicious parts.
Do you think that the increased availability of digital games makes it easier or harder for people to learn game literacy?
I hope that it makes it easier. But in my research, for example, around people, or in this case, families who've had a case of a problem gaming or a game addiction, I also found that oftentimes, for example, parents who have had a child, or typically son, and that went so far that they brought them to social workers in their municipality for game addiction, oftentimes still barely could name the game that their child was playing. So there is a resistance still as well two games where people maybe don't really want to learn about them, where games at the same point, right? And that is a really interesting situation here. As you say, they are everywhere in society. Trying to understand to contemporary youth culture or contemporary digital society without understanding games is a fool's errand. They are such a big part that we cannot leave them away and hope to understand the world right now. At the same time, they are oftentimes happening in private. There's not the same sort of public viewing or broadcasting. It's a very split community where people play very different games and have different practices. So it's hard to make any sort of generalized statements about that. So getting into that and learning about that can then become more difficult. And it is something that is still seen as, we could see that as low culture, where games are still not getting, even though they are so important for society and economy and for understanding what's up in our schools, they're still not getting the same space in our culture as film, television, which also have been low culture before, right? Then it was theater and ballet that were meaningful. And so there is this sort of time that it takes for a new form of cultural expression to become something that is mainstream accepted, right? We're just now, I guess, witnessing that comics are everywhere. And so that took a generation and then some. So yes, it's still at the same point, low culture discourse around games that aren't fully seen as culture, while they already are so impactful that we need to understand them.
You mentioned a little bit a while ago, dark design patterns. What is that?
So dark design patterns, something or ways in which everybody has maybe experienced them already, are ways in which we can build infrastructure so that it's not serving the people that are using them, but it is exploiting and manipulating them in some way. A version of that probably everybody has encountered is that if you book flight tickets, the website tries to smuggle that baggage insurance somewhere in there. And instead of you booking it, oh, suddenly the price is higher. You need to go back, find that submenu and take away that little checkbox that they put there from the start, right? That would be a dark design pattern for user interface design. It's something that is designed to, in this case, low-key harm and exploit the player or the user. Dark design in the sense of games is something that is game design elements, right? We talked about how games express themselves through rules, maybe rules elements or design elements that have to do with also monetization. So how companies that make games get in the end paid. One side note, oftentimes games are free, so we can download and play them for free, but then something in the game is there that gets sold to players. That's called microtransactions. And in this case, of course, if you run a game like that, you as a game design studio have an incentive to motivate your players to buy these things that you have to sell in the game, because if you don't manage to do that, you don't make any money. So there's an incentive to include elements like that exploit, that motivate players to do that over just maybe having the nicest possible game. And also at this moment, because that is a question that comes up repeatedly, if there's one piece of like sort of simple advice that I can give to parents about games, it's like making sure or taking a look that your kids on their mobile devices specifically play games that you actually buy for them instead of downloading things for free, because the free games are oftentimes sort of, if we are generalizing here, more problematic because they have to include these dark design elements in order to get people to spend that money on microtransactions and in-game items. So it's better to look up some good games and buy them from the start, because that would be helpful here. But yes, so back on track, dark design patterns in that case mean elements of game design that is meant to harm players for the benefit of the company that is designing the game. So these could be reward mechanisms where players who play for a certain amount of time get then rewards out of that push them to even push it further and spend even more time. Behaviorist research, for example, has shown that particular reward patterns, and these are old behaviorist studies with rats in cages, electroshocks, food pellets, so really the dark side of psychology from nowadays, that they are still absolutely being used in reward schedules in games, basically as a status quo, as a baseline, right? And then to motivate players to spend more time with the games. But there's even more malicious versions of that. You could, for example, invite players to play a game together with others where they can keep step with everybody. But after a while, when they've already taken a social role in the group, now all of a sudden they cannot perform this role and cannot make good for their position in the group without spending money on items. So now you've got them in a situation where either they pay you or they lose their friends. Yeah. And at that point, it's like, that's not really cool anymore.
No, because when I'm listening to you now, what I hear is, the dark design patterns is not really the design, because if we are using games for people to learn, for people to relearn things in a rehabilitation situation, for example, or for, building up shared values that the society stands behind, it's the same tools, but it's a different outcome. Or what is your take on this? How do we balance this beauty and the beast so we have more beauty in our lives?
And this is exactly, in a sense, a summary of what I'm trying to accomplish in my work, right? So mitigate the most malicious, the most exploitative elements of games, and highlighting how we can collectively use games to have fuller, more beautiful, more human lives in the better future. So that is really great, and a great formulation there, Lina. So thank you for that. I don't think that it's necessarily games' nature that is causing the biggest problems, but that games are a space in which problems that already exist in society can express themselves in a very explosive manner. We have, for example, and also because the designers of these spaces, of these games, have control over how these spaces function and motivate behavior, right? So we have had gambling in a number of ways since forever, but making this digital and making the good old one-armed bandit, right, like a digital version of it, allows you to build different things into that. One interview with a former game design friend of mine, he taught me about how they implemented near misses into exactly such a gambling machine.
So what is near misses? Yes, please.
Exactly. A near miss in psychology or in the sort of design is that it shows you that you as a player, you missed the big win. You didn't get the jackpot, but it was close, right? And it's a psychological fallacy, because if you lose your lottery ticket, but two of your numbers were just one step away from the winning one, that doesn't make you any closer than any other, right? It's a fallacy. It's a lie that we tell ourselves. But so it's by itself already a vulnerability in the human psyche that can be exploited. And here they are very much exploiting it. So they have this one-armed bandit machine. It has 3 rows for the numbers to appear in. And you can either spend 1 coin to win in the middle row, or you can spend 3 coins to also win in the side rows, or you can even spend 5 so that you also get the diagonals. Now, those spinning results, they were fixed. So they knew the next 20 million spin results already. But whenever somebody spent only 3 coins to win, they would fix and change the results. So it looks like that if they would have spent 5, they would have won. That was not true. If they would have spent 5, they would have gotten a different result. That was legal because they weren't manipulating the wins. They were just presenting fake near misses. Right, getting this person, oh, it was, I would have won already. It's like, no, you wouldn't. They lied.
Yeah.
So
the time is running really quick. There's one thing I really want us to just touch upon very quickly now, unfortunately, but it's society values, how society values inform game design, and how this impacts the society we're living in.
Absolutely, right. And games are, in that case, a mirror to society very quickly. And they are showing some of the problematic elements. We can use games to empower people, to empower citizens, right? Sharing this idea that you can make the society you live in. You can change it. You have that ability. I think that is the core, that is the beauty of games. And we should highlight that. We should highlight making. We should highlight creativity. We should highlight play, and go away maybe from passive audiences, exploitation. We should give young people in society active critical gaming literacy so that they can understand when they're manipulated and that they can create themselves, because in the end we want kids to create the future, and I think their games can teach exactly that.
Thank you, Patrick. I will actually end our interview with this because I thought it was a brilliant ending of our talk. Thank you for joining UppTalk Weekly today.
Thank you so much, Lina.
Next week UppTalk Weekly will be in Swedish, and we will meet Professor Lars Tranvik in a talk about the global impact of lakes and the carbon cycle. Professor Tranvik's research provides insight into how the world's more than 100 million lakes and the microbes and molecules in them affect the carbon cycle and the global climate. With this, Patrick and I thank you all for joining us today, and we wish you all a great continuation of the week.